Good day, good afternoon. This is Tan Kee Wee. Today I'm going to give a talk on inflation and the dying dollar. First, I'll share with you some good news. Look at the top chart, that's the Spanish flu. As you can see, after 1-2 years, after two peaks, the deaths dropped. It's the same with COVID-19. It seems that the past few months, the peaks have become lower. But with good news comes bad news as well, because when a problem goes away, another one comes along, and this time is inflation. Let's look at US inflation. It was 7.9% in February, and maybe today or next day, the March figures will be out. It could be more than 8%. Some people think that this 7.9% for February isn't accurate either, because they use the old base from the 1980s, and their calculation shows that the US inflation in February is not 7.9%, but it is 16%. How to control inflation? This is a big issue for all of us. The textbook policy is to raise interest rates higher than inflation. That will discourage people from spending. And today, the US interest rate is 0.5%. So the US has got a long path to take. There will be many twists and turns ahead. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you how it could go out. But before I do that, please take a look at this picture of Prince William. This was photographed in 2018. He was telling the press that he had his third child. Okay? Now, if there was a photographer nearby and he took a different picture, and it looks as though Prince William was telling the press to get lost. Well, it's the same. What I'm going to tell you in the next few minutes is my point of view, and I could be wrong. But before I proceed, please read this. The first question is, what are the causes of inflation? Well, for the current one, many say it's due to COVID-19. Of course, there's a lot of truth in that, because during these past 2 years, all the governments of the world have been trying to help its citizens by giving them money, okay, handouts. In the case of the US, Jerome Powell has increased the money supply from below 5 trillion to over 20 trillion. So about $17 trillion was created. Where did all this money go to? Well, Trump handed out 3.7 trillion. Joe Biden is going to finish handing out another $6 trillion for a total of $9.7 trillion over a 2-year period. Now, if you're a Chinese, you will be pissed off that the Americans are getting $9.7 trillion. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at this chart, this one shows the China's foreign exchange reserves. And you can see around year 2000, just before China entered WTO, it had less than, even $500 billion. And today, 22 years later, it has about over $3 trillion. So the Chinese took about 21 years to accumulate $3 trillion in savings. But the Americans, they got 9.7 trillion within 2 years. So you can understand why the Chinese would be pissed off. There's another reason for this inflation that we are experiencing is the Ukrainian crisis. This has boosted inflation much further. Well, look at this. This is a chart of the richness of each country. Russia is the richest, it has $75 trillion worth of resources. And this chart shows the basket of commodity prices that have gone up. Even before the Russian crisis, the prices of commodities have been rising. Of course, with the crisis, it was given a boost even further. Russia exports many important things which we all use. This table shows all the important minerals and food they export to the world, top of which is palladium. And palladium is very important. It is used to make cars, laptops, mobile phones. So because of the importance of so many important commodities, the world is facing this current inflation. Wheat has shot up as well. Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter. Oil. Russia is the world's second largest oil exporter, and it has gone up to almost $100 a barrel. EU is particularly sensitive because they import about 30% of all their oil from Russia. Natural gas is another commodity. Russia is the world's largest gas exporter, and the EU imports about 47% of all their natural gas needs from Russia. The EU is in this tight situation now. That's because over the years, they have decommissioned coal and nuclear power plants. This used to be very important. But we are in this situation because maybe we listen too much to this 16-year-old schoolgirl. Let's go back to the last great inflation period. This is the 1970s. This chart shows you the inflation that sort of began in the mid-60s. This is for America. And it peaked in 1980. The cause of this inflation was excessive spending. At that time, President Johnson was this great crusade against communism, this in the form of the Vietnam War, and he had this belief that Americans should be better off. So there was this big welfare program called the Great Society. Unfortunately, in those years, there was also this oil crisis. And even after Johnson stepped down, Nixon, Ford, and Carter continued spending. That's because they were under the belief that during good times, you should spend. Just a recap, during those days, we were all on the gold standard, which means that if you're going to print 35 more US dollars, you must find 1 ounce of gold before you do that. But the Americans didn't do that. They printed more dollars than they had gold. A lot of the central banks in Europe and Japan realized that in the late 60s and early 70s, they began to exchange their US dollars for gold. So great was the outflow of gold from US to the rest of the world that in August 1971, President Nixon came out and said, sorry, you are no longer allowed to exchange your dollars for gold. And that began what we have today, which is the fiat money system. Any central bank can print as much paper money as they like. Well, what happened? Well, the US dollar fell because nobody wanted to hold US dollars. This chart shows the US dollar falling against the Swiss franc all the way down to 1974. Something happened in 1974. Okay? In 1974, they created this petrodollar system whereby they made arrangement with Saudi Arabia and OPEC would sell their oil in US dollars. And so all of us who need oil will have to buy US dollars before we bought oil. So that lent some support, a lot of support to the US dollars. So this chart shows here, yes, the US dollar held for a while, but not for long. After a few months, it began to fall again. Why? Because, again, they were not controlling US inflation. Besides selling the US dollars, a lot of people were, central banks especially, were not keeping the US dollar as reserves anymore. This chart shows the percentage of reserves in US dollars. It hit a peak of around 85% in 1975, and then after that, with inflation spiraling out of control, a lot of central banks decided to get rid of them. So that proportion fell from 85% all the way down to about 46% in 1990. Because in 1990, that was when the US managed to finally control the inflation. At that time, President Carter was in charge, and he hired a person, Paul Volcker, who believed that the only way to control inflation is to raise interest rates higher than inflation, and that's what he did. In 1980, the US inflation was 15%. Paul Volcker raised interest rates to 20%. So there was this 5% gap between interest rates and inflation. And that did the job, because in the next few years, US inflation started to slow down. High interest rates are bad. Borrowers get hit, the economy gets hit, workers get hit, and stocks and bonds also get hit. Today's inflation began also with excessive spending. It's not just COVID or the Ukrainian crisis. And if you look at this chart, this is the Fed interest rates over the past 40, 50 years. You see here in 1987, that was the Asian currency crisis. That's when the Greenspan lowered interest rates. And then around 2001, there was the dot-com crisis. Again, Greenspan lowered interest rates. Then around 2007, 2008, Ben Bernanke was in charge, and he lowered interest rates as well. So this is all excessive money creation over the past 30 years. So here we are, Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, and Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen is the one responsible for reversing all that Ben Bernanke had done with his QE. Jerome Powell's job was also to reverse the QE, and for many, many months up to December last year, a lot of people thought that US inflation shouldn't be a problem. Why do they believe that? Because if you look at the inflation post-Lehman Brothers, right? This chart shows US inflation plunging because of the crisis from the Lehman Brothers, and then it started to go up because people felt that the QE created by Ben Bernanke added to the money supply and would lead to inflation. Well, for a while, inflation rose, but it peaked around at 4% in 2012. So up to December last year, many people believe that current inflation will be controlled too. Just now I mentioned that a lot of people felt that the current inflation wouldn't go out of control. But I believe that this inflation is different. Because then the US dollar was king. It was and still is the dominant reserve currency. What this means is that every time the US Fed prints money, okay, this US dollar is shared with the rest of the world. In fact, 60 to 70% of all US dollar created goes outside the USA. This cannot be said of the German mark in 1922 when they had hyperinflation, or the Zimbabwean dollar in 2007, because for these two countries, their currencies were not used outside their countries. The other factor, de-dollarization, which started in year 2000 with the introduction of euro and the weaponization of the US dollar. This chart shows the share of US dollar among global central banks. As you can see, it peaked, the last peak was in 1975 at 85%, and then it's been falling ever since, right to the bottom in 1990. People were getting rid of the US dollar because they felt that the US wasn't controlling their inflation. But from 1990 onwards, they started to accumulate US dollars again. Right up to 1999. That's when the euro was introduced. With the introduction of euro, people felt that, well, let's diversify. After all, there is another currency around. And so they did. And again, the share of US dollar reserves began to fall. But then in 2009, the Greek crisis happened. And that shook confidence in the euro. Again, the US dollar share rose until 2014, when Russia invaded, or some people say liberated Crimea, okay, there were sanctions imposed on Russia. And since 2014, Russia, Iran, China began to de-dollarize. That means they didn't want to be under the thumbs of the US dollar, and so they began to use less US dollar. So what has happened? Well, it's like the tap of running water, okay, is now flowing into a smaller field. And so de-dollarization has made that. De-dollarization has given an added boost after thousands of sanctions were imposed on Russia. These sanctions are actually aimed to cripple the Russian economy. For instance, look at this Sberbank, which is maybe the biggest Russian bank. It was trading in New York at $21 way before the war. And then when they imposed these sanctions, what happened was there were rules against holding such stocks. So everybody had to sell. So great was the sell down that from a high of $21, today it's 5 cents. The money transfer system was also restricted to the Russians. So SWIFT was cut off from Russia. And so what Russians did was they tried to use, or they are using, their own system, which is the SPFS, and the Chinese system, which is the CIPS. It's the same with credit cards. Visa, MasterCard, American Express stopped allowing their customers to use them in Russia. So what Russians did was they moved over to Union Pay, which is the Chinese credit card system. E-payments, the same. Google Pay and Apple Pay were removed, and so people moved over to Alipay. But these two actions are especially de-dollarizing. Number one, Swiss banks came out to impose sanctions on Russian system, Russian millionaires as well. And you see, this has never happened before. Even the Second World War, Swiss banking system was neutral. Germans could go to Swiss bank to get their money. Britons could go to Swiss bank to get their money. But not this time round. The Swiss have come in to attack the Russians as well. The other thing, the sanctity of private property has been violated. You see, before nobody would want to seize the assets of someone else, like they did to the Russians recently. So this has got many rich people thinking, whether you're Chinese, Arabs, Africans, or whatever, you'll be thinking twice. Is my money really safe in Switzerland? Is my money or my property really safe in those countries? Because the governments could seize anytime. This is a shock. In 1971, we had the Nixon shock, okay, when Nixon came out and took the world off the gold standard. Well, what has happened in February this year, I call it the Biden shock, because this has never happened before. Even Russian central bank's foreign reserves have been frozen by the US central banks. This is unheard before. If we were to go back to the 19th century, to the Crimean War between UK, France, Ottoman Empire against the Russians, even though they were both fighting and killing each other, both sides continued to pay debts to each other. And now this has been violated. I believe that these sanctions have got an own goal to the Western financial system. A lot of unintended consequences have appeared. It's just like Saudi Arabia. Now, for a long time, they've been selling oil to China using the US dollar. But now they are thinking of selling oil to China using the Yuan. This has never happened before. And of course, to put back, the Russians have struck back. Russia has seized also the assets of Western companies, okay? And they banned the imports of over 200 goods to the Western countries. But most important is how they struck the ruble. This chart shows the ruble. Before the war, it was trading at 80 rubles per US dollar. Now, what happened is there are about 900 billion rubles, or 13 billion in US dollar terms, outside Russia. So these 900 billion rubles were used to sell or to weaken the rubles. So the ruble weakened from 80 to about 135. Now, what's the purpose of weakening the ruble? Well, with a weak ruble, what happens is that inflation will visit Russia and it will wreck the Russian economy. That was the intention. And of course, what Russian Central Bank did was they raised the interest rates from 9.5% to 20%. Of course, in the past few days, they lowered down to 17% again. But the brilliant move, I think, is that Russia came out and said, those unfriendly countries, you must buy our gas using ruble. So if you want gas, you must have ruble. Okay? All the rubles outside Russia are gone, almost all. So what you have to do? You have to borrow ruble from the Russian bank. At 17%, it's not worth it. Russia came out with another rule, which says that if you want ruble, we will sell it to you for 1 ounce of gold. Okay, 155,500 rubles for 1 ounce of gold. So if you are a European, you need gas. First of all, you need rubles. You don't want to borrow rubles because it's too expensive, 17%. So what do? You have to sell your gold for rubles. So what happens is that eventually, if this goes ahead, then a lot of gold in Western Europe will flow to Russia. In fact, this fix of gold to ruble is like setting a new gold standard. This de-dollarization will, a lot of people don't realize it, but it will slowly sink in. See, it's just like the ship has struck the iceberg. Some people will say, no, the ship is still afloat. Yeah, water is rushing in, but the ship will still stay afloat. I don't think so. As the months go on, the ship will sink. What has happened? Before February 2022, the world was centered around North America, Europe, Africa, and Middle East will supply their commodities and goods to Europe and North America, and Russia. Russia is in the east part of Europe. It wanted to integrate itself with Western Europe. This goes back to Peter the Great's time. This is way back in the 17th century. He steered Russian diplomacy, Russian culture, everything Russian towards Western Europe. And that momentum has not stopped. In the 1990s, Russia also wanted to join NATO and wanted to join the EU as well. Many times, they were all rejected. Way back in the year 2000, Putin said this: Russia is very much part of Western European culture. He himself wanted to integrate Russia with Europe. But after what has happened these past few weeks, he's probably not going to do that anymore. Yes, North America and Europe will continue to be integrated, but as far as Russia is concerned, they will not look west anymore. They will look to China, Asia, India, and the countries that supply raw materials like Middle East and Africa. They are also looking at Asia. The next question is, how do you fight inflation and how do you fight de-dollarization? Very simple, actually. Paul Volcker, what he did was to raise interest rates. And so Jerome Powell should be as aggressive by raising the interest rates to above 7.9%, and not the 3% that he has planned so far. But he's not going to do that because big business will stop him. Why? Because if you look at the rates over the years, this is the chart showing all the peaks. You can tell that the peaks are getting lower. It is getting lower because of every year as we pass, the amount of borrowings have increased. If rates go up to more than 8%, this global house of cards we live in will collapse. Why do I say that? Look at this table. In the year 2020, if we take account all the money that's printed by all the central banks, it's only $6.6 trillion. Stocks value $90 trillion. Real estate about $300 trillion. Derivatives $900 to $2,000 trillion. But in the past 2 years, the US Fed has printed $17 trillion more. So you can imagine the multiplier effect on stocks, real estate, on derivatives. We are so leveraged. Any slight increase in interest rates will kill most of us. Before I continue, I'd like to talk a bit about Ben Bernanke's quantitative easing, or QE. This was way back in 2007, remember? What he did was he bought bonds. By buying bonds on the market, you are giving cash to the market. Number one, you are creating money for the market. Number two, what he did was he lowered interest rates. It makes it cheaper for companies that are in trouble to borrow money. So that's the two things he did. But everything must come to an end. And QE must reverse. And reversing it means you stop buying bonds. When you stop buying bonds, you stop giving cash to the market. Number two, you have to slowly raise interest rates. And number three, all the bonds that you bought earlier in step one, you have to sell it. So going forward, 2 steps. Going backward, 3 steps. This chart shows what actually happened with Janet Yellen. In year 2014, she stopped buying bonds. So you can see this chart here. The amount of bonds accumulated by US Fed stopped growing around 2014. 1 year later, she raised interest rates. This is in December 2015. And then when she retired, Jerome Powell came over, and in 2018, he started to sell all the bonds which the Fed had been buying. All well is good, but the trouble is, Jerome Powell couldn't reverse Ben Bernanke's QE. Why do I say that? Well, look at this chart. This chart shows that in September, end of 2019, he started to reduce interest rates from 2.5. Now, remember I told you that because of COVID, they printed lots of money to help everyone? Well, COVID started in early 2020. Why did they start cutting rates at the end of 2019? There's one reason. Something happened in the repo market. The repo market is a big market, overnight market, okay? 1 to 2 trillion or maybe $3 trillion a day. That's how it works. Every day, at the end of every day, financial institutions have to balance their books. If they have too much money, they can lend the money in the repo market. If they have short of money, they go and borrow. Okay? So it's like the pawn shop to us. If we got not enough money, we will put our gold in the pawn shop and try and get cash back. Okay? And if we got too much money, we just go back and get our gold back. So what happened in the last quarter of 2019 was that repo rates shot up to 10%. Now, this is exceptional because repo rates shouldn't be more than the Fed funds rate, which at that time was about 2.5%. So something happened. What happened was that many financial institutions were in trouble. So what happened? Powell couldn't reverse Ben Bernanke's QE, and now he's got his own QE to reverse. His own QE means stop buying bonds at $120 billion a month, which he did in March, and raise interest rates. Well, he is doing from 0.25 to 0.5. He aims to go up to 3%. And on top of that, he's got $9 trillion worth of bonds, which he has to sell. I don't think he can do that. What happens if he cannot do that? Well, then we go back to 1970s again. That's when the Fed couldn't control inflation, people didn't like it, and they started selling the US dollars. That's probably going to happen again. So Powell is unfortunately caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. If he raises rates, the US economy suffers, and the US dollar suffers. If he keeps rates at 3%, and it doesn't raise even more than that, the US dollar will suffer, and the US economy will suffer too. So he can't really raise rates, maybe even beyond 2.5% this time around. Some people might say, this is a bit over pessimistic. If you look at the chart, the US dollar over 50-year period has gone up and down. And in fact, the past few months, it has gone up. Well, to that I say, yes, that's true. In the past, there was no alternative. But with de-dollarization, the rise of the ruble, things have changed. Third factor, there is an alternative coming, and that is the digital Yuan. China wanted to introduce this in February this year, but because of COVID and all that, tourists wasn't going to Beijing, so they pushed back the launch date. Now, if China introduces a digital yuan to the world, it will undermine the US dollar even further. But there's something which China must do first, and that is to float the Chinese renminbi. You see, you look at this chart, the Chinese renminbi has been controlled by China Central Bank for many years. The reason is because they want the exporters to benefit. Exporters benefit when the currency is stable or weak or whatever. So China has been managing the renminbi for many years. One day, this will change. And there are three things which must satisfy China before they float the Chinese renminbi. Number one, it must open its capital account. Well, the danger is that a lot of Chinese people might take their money and rush out of China. Okay? And as they always say, there are lots of dirty money. But with digital yuan, all this money can retract. Are the Chinese really intentional to take the money out of China? Well, maybe in the past. But things have changed with all these sanctions. People are thinking twice about putting their money in Switzerland and putting their money in New York banks. Just like tourists coming out of China. Years ago, China restricted tourists from leaving China because they fear that they will all leave China and don't come back. Well, not anymore. Every year, about 130 million Chinese leave the country. They go sightseeing around the world, and every year, 130 million goes home. So this fear can be discounted now. Secondly, China must rely less on exports and boost domestic demand. Since China entered the WTO, they've been relying a lot on exports for their earnings. But in the past few years, this has come down a bit to maybe about 18%. Perhaps this is not good enough. I think China wants to wait for this to go even lower. Because Chinese household consumption as a percentage of GDP is still very low. It's 38%. Whereas for another country like USA or any developing country or Japan, the household consumption as a proportion of GDP is 70% or above. So that means Chinese people are not spending their money enough in China. So you're still relying too much on your exports. So this must change. If you look at Chinese policies, dual circulation, This is to direct activity into the domestic market or common prosperity. This also means that less inequality will lead to higher domestic spending in China. And if you look at the latest 5-year plan, it's always focused on boosting the domestic economy. So this will take time. The third thing China must do is make sure that more and more regions trade with China and they start using the renminbi. Well, 2013, China started the BRI, and today it has 145 countries have signed up, out of a total of 195 countries. So basically, it's 3/4 of the world have signed on to BRI, and BRI will all be using renminbi. And when that comes, all these three conditions are fulfilled, China will very easily float the renminbi. And when the renminbi is floated, the US dollar will come crashing down. Again, people say, Kiwi, it's not possible. It took about 30 years for the US dollar to replace sterling pound. But there is a difference now. Okay, I think it'll be faster. Today, if you want to use the digital yuan, all you need is just a smartphone. With your smartphone, you download the app, and that's it. You can start using the digital yuan. A comparison would be, let's say, TikTok. TikTok is very popular. Last year, it was the highest downloaded app in the world. In fact, TikTok has hit the 1,000 billion mark faster than Facebook, WhatsApp, WeChat, or any other social media apps. So the digital yuan, I believe, will be like this. Remember just now I said that Jerome Powell couldn't do much to protect the US dollar? Well, what else can the US do? For one, it must do something to repair and improve its fragile economic base. Let's take it as one example. In January this year, there was a bridge in Pittsburgh. It collapsed overnight. And this was one day before Joe Biden visited the city. What this shows is that there's a lot of infrastructure works needed to be carried out in the USA. Then the question is, why are they spending $813 billion in the next year on its military? Why? In fact, the budget for the US military is more than the next 11 countries put together. It's bigger than the Vietnam War. A lot of people ask that question, but I have the answer. The US military has one job, and that job is to preserve the US dollar as a reserve currency. It's because of this that makes the US empire what it is today. Some people say that the US got no long-term plans. I disagree. They have. Since 1991, when the USSR collapsed, the aim of the US leaders is to remain as number one. And this you can see in the Wolfowitz Doctrine of 1992. The objective is to prevent anyone from coming up. All growing competitors must be squashed. That's the doctrine. Who are the main competitors of USA today? EU, Russia, and China. Okay? But with this Russian-Ukrainian conflict, I think Nord Stream has been shelved. So the integration between the EU and Russia has been shelved. Inflation will hit the EU, and now LNG from the US and weapons from the US will be sold to EU, and the American manufacturers will benefit. And of course, the US dollar wins again. So, EU is out, Russia is out, and some say that plan has always been to fix EU and Russia because the main target is China. Why China? The trouble is the Chinese economy keeps on growing. It's like a cockroach that you cannot get rid of. It keeps on growing. Okay? In 2014, Chinese GDP, using purchasing power parity as a measure, overtook the USA. Fear bells rang in those years because there's this threat that China will even overtake USA GDP in nominal terms by 2030. In panic, the US got RAND Corporation to come out with a report how to stop China's rise. The report was commissioned immediately after this PPP figures were released, and this report showed a few things. Number one, the US and its allies should start a war with China to reduce China's GDP by 35%. Okay? And the report suggests a conventional war confined to the Asian region. It's very simple. You look at South China Sea. Once there is conflict there, all shipping will be stopped. And if shipping is stopped at the South China Sea, China cannot trade. China would die. That's the idea. And so you can understand why, when Trump took over in 2018, he started this Cold War. It attacks China in many, many fronts: economy, military, technology, even COVID-19. In November 2020, NATO realigned their mission, and the new mission and the new adversary is China. 2 months ago, the US had another report, which is the Indo-Pacific Strategy. This couched in more diplomatic terms, but the impact is the same. You must challenge China. You know, I've been talking about this Cold War between China and US. Will it lead to a hot war? Well, first of all, a hot war can be profitable. You know, when the US invaded Libya or Iraq, they confiscated a lot of gold and oil from these two countries. If there's a hot war between US and China were to lose, well, there's a lot of gold to be confiscated from China too. The Chinese economy will be wrecked, and China could eventually become just a factory of the US economy. Why am I talking about a hot war? Well, it's very simple. The currency of the victor will reign and affect all global asset prices. That's why I'm talking about a hot war. For instance, you know, 1944, if you were to hold Japanese occupation currency, you might feel rich. But 1 year later, when the Japanese are defeated, your Japanese currency becomes useless. So that's why we look at a hot war and who might win. For a long time, I thought that, hot war is not possible. That's because if you look at the trading links between the US and China, it's so intense. They export and import to each other so much and over so many years. Both love money and unlikely to lose it just because of something else. But lately, I've been thinking twice about it. Let's ask an ex-diplomat. Tian Kai last December gave a speech. He was the Chinese ambassador to US for a long time. But last December, when he gave a speech, he said this something very important, which made me notice. He said the US will eventually try every possible means and spare no effort to suppress, contain, divide, and besiege China. From a diplomat who is no longer a diplomat, he was telling everything as he saw it. Did he mean that the US wants a war? Let's check with a political scientist, and then let's ask a neocon. Graham Allison wrote a famous book in 2017, whereby he said that looking at history, all rising powers and incumbent powers will usually fight it out. So he's based on 500 years of European history, and he showed that a fight is likely. And he also said that Taiwan will be the flashpoint. Let's check another guy, Elbridge Colby. He wrote a book last September, whereby he said about the same thing. He said that a war over Taiwan is desirable because basically you cannot stop China's economic rise. He also said that if a war were to start now, the US has a winning chance. And he said the same thing about Taiwan again, that China must be provoked to appear as the aggressor. To appear as the aggressor. Doesn't that ring a bell? Because from what we are reading now, most of the media are saying that Russia is the aggressor in the Ukraine conflict. Whether that's true or not, we don't really know. History will tell us maybe a bit more about the truth. Just as if we look at Japan as aggressor, for a long time, even up to today, Hollywood has framed Japan as the aggressor. But actually, history tells us that Japan was provoked. From 1938, there were trade sanctions against Japan. In July 41, the Panama Canal was closed to Japan. And in July 41, Japanese assets were seized by USA. And to top it off, in August 1941, there was an oil embargo on Japan. That is crucial because without oil, the Japanese Imperial Army could not continue its war in China. So they had no choice but to strike Pearl Harbor so that they could go on to seize the oil fields in Indonesia. Well, we have listened to a diplomat, ex-diplomat. We've heard from political scientists. We heard from neocon strategists. Let's look at this topic of hot war from the game theory point of view. This is prisoner's dilemma. Basically, every country, in this case China and USA, has two choices: go for peace or go for war. China will be in red, USA will be in blue. If both go for war, then we'll end up with -5 points each, because both will lose out. If both, of course, don't want war and go for peace, then the points both gain will be +5 and +5. That would, of course, be a far better solution than -5. Now, the question is, what if one party cheats? So let's say both decides to go for peace, okay, but the USA wage war. So we are in this sector, which means that China loses out, -5, and the USA will win bigger, +10. It's the same. If both decide to go on peace and the US goes for peace and China wages war, then China will have 10 points and the US will have -5 points. Now, so of course, the best position to be in is that both parties go for peace, then both will get +5 and +5. But crucial to this peace position is that both must keep their word, like gentlemen. If you ask Putin, Putin will say, well, the US didn't keep their word. Because in 1990, James Baker told Gorbachev that NATO will not move 1 inch further east. In fact, 14 countries have joined NATO. Let's ask the Chinese. When Nixon met up with Mao Zedong, they agreed on a one China policy, which still holds, but US told China that it will remove its military installations in Taiwan. That hasn't really happened yet. Secondly, in the third communique between Deng Xiaoping and Reagan, China understood that the US said that they would reduce arms purchase sales to Taiwan in return for China's peaceful policy towards Taiwan. Well, suppose from the Chinese point of view, they have been peaceful towards Taiwan, but why is the US continuing to sell arms in quality and quantity to Taiwan? So, like I said, the best position in the prisoner's dilemma is that both go for peace, both keep their word, but if you know your other party will not keep their word, then your best strategy is to prepare for war. And so we end up with -5, -5. Of course, this is not the best solution. Well, I'm giving you examples of Russians and the Chinese saying that the Americans didn't keep their word. But how do we know? We are not insiders. Maybe the Americans have their stories to tell too. Maybe the Russians and the Chinese have had many incidents where they didn't keep their word. We don't know. So it's like viewing a lover's quarrel. There's her version of events, there's his version of events, and of course there's the truth, which we will never know. Very often, talks cannot settle disputes. And what happens? Then the rule of force enters. That means a hot war is inevitable. The question is, when? I refer to military reports again to compare the military strengths of both China and USA. According to this report, released more than a year ago, in 1999, when China have not yet joined WTO, Chinese military capability was right up only to their own coast. But in 2021, because of their missiles and all that, Chinese military capability could go right up to Guam. Guam is where the US has a military base. According to this report, if you give them another few more years, 2025, the Chinese military capability will stretch right to the half of the Pacific Ocean. And that makes all the US carriers almost useless. So according to this report, if there's going to be a hot war, then they must strike, the US must strike before 2025. Because beyond 2025, the Chinese military will have the upper hand. But, such reports are produced by military people, and maybe they just want a bigger budget. I would say instead of 2025, maybe before 2030. Now, if there's a hot war, there's a danger it will escalate, because if one side is losing and they take the view that I don't want to live in a world where I am number two, then what would they do? They would really escalate, which means nuclear war could happen. This is, of course, the worst scenario for any of us. And if you look at history or legend, in the Hindu epic of Mahabharata, there was a nuclear war in 2500 BC. Both sides lost the war. So that is not a rosy picture to give to you. But I have the good news. And the good news is that maybe we might not see a hot war ending in a nuclear war, because today's armies rely on satellites for directing their soldiers, their missiles, their planes. And if you can take down all the satellites, it might stop the other side from even wanting to attack you after that. And just last November, Russia perfected and put into operation their Star Warrior system. What is this? This is a system whereby the missiles could shoot down all the 32 GPS satellites the US has. If you can bring down the US satellites, then there's really not much the US military can do after that. The Chinese are apparently supposed to have their own system using laser beams, and it's supposed to be ready this year. And the US are, I'm sure, coming up with their own system. We don't know, because military secrets are never readily available to public. Thank you for listening to my talk. I shall end up by doing the key summary. Number one, inflation is bad for US dollar and the US economy. Raising interest rates high will be bad. Keeping it even at 3% is equally bad. De-dollarization is bad for the US dollar and US economy. And there are competitors coming. The ruble, the digital yuan, they are all coming. So the question is, how do you prolong US dollar dominance? My answer is that they have to use their military to act. And according to what we know, if the US were to win a victory in a hot war, then they must act before 2030. Thank you once again.